Thank you for joining the Judaism Demystified podcast. We have the pleasure of having Rabbi Yamin Levy on the podcast, and we want to talk about your new book, The Mysticism of Andalusia. And we wanted to know what it is that made you want to write this book, and also what is the book about?
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you for having me on your podcast. I appreciate it. The title of the book is The Mysticism of Andalusia, Exploring HaRambam's Mystical Tradition. And to answer your question, what led me to publish or to write this book, it's 30 years of teaching HaRambam and primarily the guide of the Perplexed. And what's always been most perplexing to me is how the guide has just been misunderstood by so many very smart people. That's the real truth. HaRambam himself states loud and clear that the purpose of his Moreh HaNevukhim, Dalalat al-Hairin, is to teach mysticism, to explain Maaseh Bereshit and Maaseh Merkabah. He doesn't get more clear than that. Look at his introduction to the guide. Look at the introduction to Chelik 3 of the guide, section 2, chapter 17 or 18. He says it explicitly. He begins his Mishneh Torah with 4 chapters, the first 2 explaining Maaseh Merkabah and the next 2 explaining Maaseh Bereshit. Now, having said that, and of course, the world of academia knows that the first 4 chapters of the Mishneh Torah are Maaseh Merkabah and Maaseh Bereshit, and yet they insist on this idea that it's just natural sciences. That's what the Rambam wants us to know. And I'm getting old, and I said to myself, I have to put this in writing. Now, I do want to say, before I tell you what the thesis of the book is, that I'm an orphan. That's the real truth. I'm an orphan because among my rabbinic colleagues, I'm a provocateur and on the fringes of religion, and among my academic colleagues, I'm just a rabbi, just trying to be a rabbi, you know what I'm saying? So the thesis, the primary thesis of my book, and this is what I've been teaching since my eyes were really open to what the guide is about, and I'm grateful to my teachers, Hakham José Faur, Zichrono Livracha, Professor David Blumenthal from Emory University, as well as Professor Rabbi Isidore Twersky of Harvard University, and I do have to, express words of gratitude to Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik of Yeshiva University, who had, while not as explicit as the way I put it in my book, but certainly understood HaRambam as, just work of great, profound spiritual worth. So the theses of my book are threefold. Thesis number 1, which is very important. HaRambam was not an innovator. My good friend Micah Goodman in Israel wrote a book called The Book That Changed Judaism.
Yep, we read it.
He's very upset with me because I take him to task all the time. He's wrong. Flat and plain, he's wrong. The Moreh HaNevukhim did not change Judaism. The Moreh HaNevukhim is an expression of what Judaism's about. HaRambam was a transmitter of the rabbinic and Gaonic tradition of Judaism. There is no source. I'm sorry to get so passionate, but there is no source in the early to late medieval great scholars that is more authentic and a better representation of what Judaism, rabbinic Judaism, is about. There's no doubt with regards to what I'm saying. So HaRambam was a transmitter. And I have a new book that's coming out, Be'ezrat Hashem. It's called The Fathers of Andalusia. And I'm tracing Rabbi Sadia Gaon through Shemuel Ibn Tibon and showing how it's a direct link of tradition of a Judaism that is both profoundly mystical, disciplined philosophically, and rational. Thesis number 2 is that HaRambam, Maimonides, Rabbi Moshe ben Mimon was a great mystic. And I know the academic world wants to, put me out in the fringes and Faur in the fringes. Oh, these are just rabbis talking. Of course, they want to make him a mystic. He was a neo-Aristotelian. That's how they want to frame HaRambam. Of course, HaRambam studied philosophy that he had access to in the Middle Ages. There's no question. We do that too. Yeah. But to say that he was just, spitting out, Greek philosophy is nonsense and silly. Absolutely silly. What HaRambam did do, and my good friend Professor Menachem Kellner agrees with me on this, is that he utilized the language of philosophy to better explicate Judaism. And that's what we do today. A good rabbi, a good teacher of Judaism today will use contemporary modern language that explains and makes clear ideas that are ancient and that are our own. Doesn't mean that I'm buying into the culture that created these concepts or ideas or refined these concepts or ideas. The opposite. I'm utilizing them appropriately and responsibly, and that's exactly what HaRambam did. And the third thesis in this book, and trust me when I tell you, it was very hard to finally decide to include those portions in my book. They're very provocative, and they're so contrary to the kind of Judaism we're living today. This idea that there is a Judaism that is authentic and deeply spiritual and mystical, that is not Kabbalistic and is not superstitious and is not theurgic and is not magical and is not full of charms and ideas that are not rooted in Judaism. And I urge your readers or your listeners to read the chapter I wrote on good magic and bad magic. Those that have read the book tell me that that is one of the most important chapters in the book, because Judaism is full of magic. You read in Pirkei Avot, all the magic that happened in the Beit HaMikdash, correct? That there was never a fly around the meat, and omdim tzfufim u'mishtachavim revachim, they would stand all crowded, but then when they would bow, there was plenty of miracles happening day and night, magic. And so why not other kinds of magic? And what I show in my book is that the popular English translations of the Talmud I don't want to mention names. I think you all know what I'm talking about. Misread and misunderstand basic Gemarot to this fact. Basic Gemarot. And there's one Talmudic text that I discussed there that is completely misinterpreted and mistranslated by the famous, popular Talmud translators of our generation. And so those are the three theses. I say in my introduction, I don't mean to divide at all. My goal really is to unify, but I want to create a movement of those who are like-minded, who want to bring atara liyoshna, to bring back Judaism to what it originally was and what it's about.
That really resonates with us because we feel like we're trying to do the same thing. And I think what you're doing is amazing, very courageous, because obviously you can get yourself in hot water these days. We know ourselves when you talk about these topics. But I actually want to go kind of I want to start from the first point that you made about Rambam being the transmitter and of tradition and not a daat yachid. So I understand why his detractors, or maybe people from the Kabbalistic side, would want to say that he is like an original thinker and he's a rebel and all that. But why is it that even some Maimonideans, like Micah Goodman, are presenting it this way? You want to add to that? Or?
I do want to add to that also that you also mentioned the transmission, but when it comes to the HaRambam's mysticism in the introduction of the third chelek, he actually says that what he says was not a matter of tradition, and that he is basically trying to understand mysticism to the best of his own ability.
Okay, so I have to answer that very important point.
Sure. Yeah.
That's unfortunate, and you need a teacher to understand when you're reading these texts in the guide. So I want to explain that. If you mind, Benji, let me start with that point.
Yeah, sure.
Okay? All right.
Because this is very important, and you're absolutely right, Ben Sion, that HaRambam says this at the end, towards the end of Chelek Gimel. But HaRambam also begins the Moreh HaNevukhim with a letter to his student. People don't even realize it's there. There is a preamble to his introduction of the guide. And it's a short 450-word letter to a student, one student. And he says to the student, I found that you are worthy. We've studied together, and you're so passionate about wanting to learn the secrets of the prophets, and you're very good in logic and mathematics and the sciences, and we've parted ways. And being that we've parted ways, I decided I'm going to put this in writing. And he says the last line of that letter is, and each chapter will reach you wherever you may be. And so in my book, I asked the question, and I learned this from Hakham Faur, and it actually appears also, similar development in his book, Homo Mysticus. What's this letter doing here? Now, the academics like to, talk about how the Mishnah in Masechet Chagigah says you're only allowed to teach the secrets of Judaism to one person at a time. You know what I'm saying? Maaseh Bereshit and Maaseh Merkabah, one or two students at a time. So here HaRambam is finding like this, strategy. I wrote this book for one student, so I'm not violating any Jewish law or any Mishnaic law. Please, HaRambam knew he was publishing this book. It was going to be read by thousands of people. What is HaRambam doing in this letter is very, very important. HaRambam tells us, Pension, that Jewish mysticism is lost. There is no such thing as a written record of Jewish mysticism. You can't. And why can't you? Because there is no language that is appropriate to express a mystical experience. The closest we have is Shir HaShirim, which Rabbi Akiva called Kodesh Kodashim. Why? Because Shir HaShirim is poetic, and a poetic attempt at describing a profoundly deep mystical experience, union with the divine. That's what Shir HaShirim is when it's studied correctly. And if you guys want to study it with me one day, I'll blow your minds in terms of what Shir HaShirim is. But you have to be prepared to go into a deep meditation and really extract the experiential element of what Shir HaShirim is. I know I'm going a little bit far out for your listeners, but I apologize for that.
Not at all.
HaRambam is very clear. Language cannot describe. Mysticism is a discipline that is lost. So how do we access it? Number one, every student who embarks on this process has an independent venue, access point. And so when HaRambam tells his student at the end of that letter, these chapters will reach you wherever you are, he's not talking about a geographic location. He's talking about each chapter will reach you at your appropriate stage in the trajectory of spiritual development. Wherever you are, b'asher husham, where you are at in your spiritual development. And I experience this all the time. I could read chapters over and over again, chapters that I read 5 years ago or 2 years ago, a year ago, and I experience it differently completely.
It's very true.
That's what he means. Now, what he's saying at the end of the guide is that you have to access the spiritual, the mystical experience individually. He's saying, I can't write a book. The Chachamim have not provided us with books on what the mystical experience is, but it is accessible. And if you ask me the right questions, I'll bring you to that. But it is accessible. You induce the experience.
Mm-hmm.
And where my good friend, I don't know if you read the back of, Professor Menachem Kellner's endorsement of my book. He says, and my friends, everybody said to me, you had so many other good endorsements. Why did you put this one? I said, because I'm honest. He disagrees with a fundamental point of mine. The point he disagrees with is that there's such a thing as union with the divine. There is. And in Maimonides, in HaRambam's economy of ideas, the Ribono Shel Olam is transcendent, which means distant, but also imminent, very imminent, and can be fully experienced. So how could these two contradictions exist? They do. And all one has to do is look into the world of quantum physics. Contradictions in quantum physics exist all the time. We all learned it in school. Is light particles or waves? How could it be both? It is both. In Judaism, in the world of the spirit, we have the same thing. Hashem is both transcendent and immanent at the same time. We have to access those points. And it's not in my quote, but it's something I teach on a regular basis. And if you go to the Chabura, I gave a class. I only allowed them to post one of my classes on mysticism. My other classes I felt was just too far out. But for me, the point, mysticism is that point where we recognize how infinitesimally small we are in the scheme of the grand universe that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created, but at the same time, how magnificently grand human consciousness is, and the incredible miracle of human consciousness. It's that point where these two meet where mysticism and the mystical experience takes place. I'm talking too much. Ask me another. I hope I answered your question.
I just have
Your
a lot of
question.
questions.
Benji, what was your question?
Well, we can go back to my original question later, because now we're on a whole new
Different
more
tangent.
But I want to get back to your original.
we will. But I want to first of all, I want to push back a little bit on that idea of immanence, because comparing it to quantum physics, right? The quantum world is still built into the structure of our physical universe. So the physical universe is not God. The physical right.
Correct.
So I just want to clear that up for people.
So there's nothing to clear. You're absolutely right. So let me clarify.
Right.
Let me clarify. The atomic universe, which began, and I'm not a physicist, I just want to put that out there, began 14 billion years ago with the Big Bang, right, is Maaseh Bereshit. Maaseh Merkabah is going beyond the atomic universe. It's accessing something that's beyond time and space. Now, HaRambam repeatedly says the first stage to knowing Hashem and accessing immanence with Hashem is knowing in order to induce. This is very important. Knowing in order to induce a sense of profound love and awe of God. That's what it's about. And so it's certainly not God, absolutely not. But it's the access point. You heard of C.S. Lewis, the author, the writer?
Yes.
Yes. So C.S. Lewis has this fantastic little image where he says, when you're training your dog to fetch a stick, right? So you throw your stick out into the field and you point to it. And the dog sniffs your finger. The dog thinks, oh, you want him to sniff your finger. He thinks that's what's important. And you're trying to tell him, no, my finger's pointing at something more important. It's that stick I want you to get.
So basically,
the universe is pointing at, is the access point. It's pointing at something much greater. There's another chapter in, and I'm going to get back to you in a minute. There's another chapter in the guide, in the Moreh HaNevukhim. It's section 2, chapter 14, I believe, where HaRambam starts talking about the dimensions of the universe. You remember those chapters? And he spends so much ink on telling us that it's 800,000 mil this way and thousands of mil this way. Yeah. And I like to think to myself, imagine if HaRambam had access to the James Webb telescope. If HaRambam could really understand what it means to see a star that is 13 billion years away. So why did HaRambam write those chapters for his student? In order to induce this sense of awe, awesomeness. That's where we have to be, inducing in ourselves the awe of God. So why do we... Go ahead, Ben. I can go on and on and on.
I hear your point, and I actually think that when you say immanence, sometimes people might maybe relate that to the Kabbalistic version of immanence. But what you're really trying to say is that there's no access point between man and God, literally. It's
absolutely
more right. Okay, so I just want to clear that up, because
absolutely right.
That's the issue. That's where the word immanence is kind of
HaRambam in chapter 154, a chapter that when I teach the guide, I usually begin with that chapter, 154. He says that only Moshe Rabbeinu was given that kind of access we're talking about. But through Hashem's attributes and actions, we can induce and really come as close. It's a trajectory of closeness. Everybody, HaRambam speaks of flashes of lightning in a dark night. And so the beginner student gets a flash and sees a little bit. The more advanced students have more access, more flashes of light. Moshe Rabbeinu and Avraham Avinu had full daylight all the time, which was a function also of the way they lived, the providence, the hashgacha that they experienced on an ongoing basis. That's the way they went on their day to day.
He bypassed the post-rational imagination, basically. He got somewhere where no one else really ever got.
Okay, good. That's Faurian language. Thank you. Yes, beautiful. I love that.
So what I want to understand, actually, now that we're on the topic of Moreh HaNevukhim, because I think a lot of confusion is that we know that mysticism wasn't written down, right? Like you said, it was lost, and there was only Rashi Perakim.
Not lost. It can't. Language
can't be written, right?
Can't be written. There is no language that can.
Exactly.
It can't be articulated. It can't be expressed, and it can't be written.
Right. So if that's the case, because I think a lot of confusion is for a lot of people is that people think that the Moreh HaNevukhim is actually Maaseh. It's actually the Maaseh Merkabah, but in reality, it's just pointing to it's the chapter headings, correct?
Rashi Perakim. That's correct. He says that HaRambam. That's what HaRambam says, and that's how you have to understand that original letter to his student. You know what I'm saying? Right. These are various chapters and points of what am I looking for? Of inspiration at certain points. You know what I'm saying? It opens gates, it opens venues. And as we mature intellectually, spiritually, we begin understanding these chapters in different ways.
So I actually had a conversation with you mentioned him in your book, actually, Zevi Slavin from Slavin from
Seekers. I have one line for him in my book. I promised him one line.
Yeah. So actually, no, I was in contact with him because he was asking about certain Sephardi opinions and approaches, because I think a lot of mistakes, because I heard one of his presentations and he mentioned Menachem Kellner, and he was saying that, and it's not just him, there's a lot of like academics who will say that Menachem Kellner denies that Maimonidean, the mystic. But when we had him on our podcast, he cleared all that up. He said, of course, he is a mystic. It's just how you define mysticism that matters. So,
right.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Sure. So I want to hear what you have to say about.
So yeah, Professor Kellner, Menachem Kellner, told me in an email. I shouldn't speak for him, but he regrets the title of his book. People coerced him into that title.
Yes, he said that on our podcast as well.
He did say that. I'm glad he said it. Good, because I was happy about that, because there's no doubt HaRambam was a mystic. There's no doubt, and there's no doubt that authentic Jewish mysticism is grounded in rationalism. The first step in mystical ambitions is to purge the mind
of the nonsense.
Well, yeah, HaRambam talks about this. He frames it as negative theology. The academics love that. The Greeks came up with that negative theology. Of course, anybody who's intelligent knows there's such a thing as negative theology, because you have to purge the mind. You have to clean. You have to make your brain tahor. Yeah. The minute you start introducing corporeality or any form of giving God any form of emotions or physicality, in HaRambam's image of the palace, you're facing the wrong direction. You're not even facing the palace yet. You're in the opposite direction. And so the process begins with that. Now, there's an interesting difference between Islam and Judaism. Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd and these great, Islamic philosophers who were also purists in terms of rationalism and philosophical precision, Ibn Sina says that this is good for the educated men. But the women and children, okay, let them have a little bit of corporeality. Let them have a little bit of that. HaRambam, back to Rav Sadia Gaon, this traces back. Absolutely not. The children and the women have to have pure of mind as well. They have to cleanse their minds and their soul and their spirit of the, again, I'm sorry to use derisive terms, of the nonsense, of that which really fills the mind with the yeast of the fermented bread. You know what I'm saying? We got in the eve of Passover. Cleanse the spirit of that. I was so saddened. I this past week, a member of our larger community called to tell me that his wife was diagnosed with cancer. And he's been getting so many phone calls from people, change your mezuzot of the house, recite certain tehillim every day. And he says to me, Rabbi Levy, what do I make of that? And so how do you respond to someone like he's heartbroken? You know what I'm saying to you? He's struggling, he's suffering. And believe me, if I felt that changing mezuzot would help even a little bit, I would say, of course, go change your mezuzot. But it doesn't. That is what I call really the cancer of the soul. It makes you dumber. It weakens you spiritually. You follow what I'm saying to you? You guys
I'm totally on board. I know all about this. It's
horrible.
Terrible.
It's horrible that I quote in my book how in Eastern Europe, whenever a plague would hit the Jewish community, the rabbis would do this investigation of checking people's mezuzot. And if a mezuzah was wrong or false, they would blame that family for the plague.
Oh my God.
And this is historically documented. And you say, what kind of Judaism is that? First of all, it's so foreign to rabbinic Judaism. But how could you ethically, morally, even introduce something like that? I'm sorry, I'm talking so much. Go ahead.
So I actually wanted to say, just for our listeners who don't know what negative theology is, or apophatic knowledge, it's basically the idea that you can't say what God is, but only what God is not. That's the way to come to understanding of the divine. So for the sake of the conversation that we're having right now, the nonsense that we're discussing is that people often project their own ideas of what God ought to be onto God and say that God is this and God is that, and he functions in this way, which will actually be a great segue to the topic of Kabbalah, which does that often. But I wanted to, before we move ahead, I wanted to go back to my original question to you so that we don't forget about that. And then we can move on to the topic of Kabbalah, which is why people like Maimonides come to the conclusion that Rambam was a, daat yachid, an innovator, and he's kind of straying from tradition. Where does that come from?
So that's a good question. It comes from a complete lack of sensitivity to the historical process. You know what I'm saying? To history. That's the real truth. And so let me explain. After the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash, Jews moved in various directions. And in the early Middle Ages, I'm talking very early Middle Ages, with the birth of Islam throughout North Africa, Central Asia, as far as Iraq and Iran, and then its movement into Europe, southern Spain. The Jewish people found a society that embraced many of Rabbinic Judaism's values, primarily the value of education, of knowledge, of the pursuit of knowledge, of how to read a text. I have a chapter in my book called Literally Reading and Reading Literally. And this was an enlightened period in history. Many of our sciences, mathematics, were born, algebra, the etymology of the word algebra is Arabic. Algorithm is Arabic, the etymology of the word algorithm. While this was taking place, Europe was in the Dark Ages. It was run by the Catholic Church that denied people access to knowledge, to thinking, to philosophy. And if any culture changed Judaism, and I say this with respect, Micah Goodman is my friend, as are many in that chevra, in that group. It's the Balei Tosafot, it's the Europeans who introduced so many foreign ideas into Judaism. Now, again, we're all one people. I want to be clear. And time and evolution of our religion and of our culture has created a large net around many different groups and practitioners. But HaRambam opens his Mishneh Torah with a chain of the Masorah, of the tradition. Mm-hmm. And he does that for a very clear purpose. He's not the first to do that. Rav Sadia Gaon did it, Rav Chofni Gaon did it also. This was very important to them, to put out there, you're going to read my Torah. I just want you to know I'm not inventing it. I'm the next link in the chain from those that preceded me. That's what HaRambam is saying. Yes.
The Catalonian Spanish community or tradition that came in after the Rambam's time, which was influenced by the Franco-German kind of schools and like you said, Christianity.
I didn't say that. You said that, but
but that's obviously we were more influenced by Islamic culture, and they were more influenced by Christian culture. I
don't think we were influenced. I think we found a culture, a society that resonated with our values, with rabbinic values. The example I use to make this point very clearly is the tragedy of Rabbeinu Avraham ibn Ezra. He went north, he went to Christian Spain, and he couldn't find a place. He had to go from town to town, from city to city, because he couldn't find a community that embraced his Andalusian traditions.
Well, also in his time, I mean, the Ashkenazi Jewry was extremely minimal, right? It was like less than 10%, I think, of all world Jewry at the time.
I don't know those statistics.
Yeah. There's
he went from where he went. There's plenty of Jews. I mean,
Yeah. So my question is this, because the Rambam, when he does point that out, the connection between the Gaonic tradition and Andalusia, which is, I think it was Moshe Hanoch, right? And it kind of, makes it interesting from the Catalonian kind of perspective. What is their chain of Masorah in terms of connecting to the Gaonim? Besides studying their works, like, do they have a direct line and same connection?
I don't think
or is that too controversial to ask?
Yeah, it's not just controversial to ask. I don't want to presume myself to be a historian to that degree. I don't see it. I don't see a linkage. I don't see a connection. That's the real truth.
So that
just the way, and I point this out in my book, the difference in terms of the way European Jewry read text and the way the Andalusian tradition, our relationship to the text, is so radically different. So radically different.
Can we circle back to something that I want to get a little bit of clarification on? So the goal of mysticism in Andalusian thinking is unio mystica, as you said, right? I want to define terms. What does that mean? What does that mean? That there's a union with God. What is the nature of that union? Can we define the terms? Because I think that when someone hears that, they can interpret that in
many ways,
100 ways.
Yeah.
That's correct. And so the truth of the matter is there's more than one way of interpreting that. There's no doubt about it. And you know, I could leave it with that, but I'll just say the following.
Or at least within the Andalusian.
According to HaRambam, straight out, Andalusian tradition.
Yes.
Prophecy is real.
100%.
Prophecy exists. And no apologetics here. I'm saying to you, prophecy exists. There's a beautiful pasuk in the Mikra, at the end of Parshat Naso. Moshe Rabbeinu the Mishkan is complete, and the grammatical structure of the word is that Moshe Rabbeinu could hear. God is speaking to himself. Vaidaber elav Hashem, and the grammatical structure of the word is that, and Rashi brings it out, that God is speaking to God's self, and Moshe Rabbeinu is hearing in on the conversation.
Like
in on God.
Okay.
I'm saying to you, and so another element of mystical union is just being clued in to the knowledge and wisdom that is, I'm going to use again, New Age terms, in the universe. Mystical union means when I become wiser, I live on a plane of higher consciousness. Spiritually, that is deepened, and it's transformative, completely transformative. And so, yes, that term means many, many things, and depending on where one is in the trajectory of spiritual growth. And so my friend Rabbi Professor Kellner says, no, there's no such thing. You can't have a union with the infinite. And I'll argue that it means a lot of things, and I believe that you can. I believe that you can. And I've encountered people that have, and our tradition is based on the fact that there were such a thing as prophets and Nevi'im who did.
I'm wondering if perhaps this difference between Professor Kellner and you is more semantic than actual.
Could be, might be.
Because it could be that Professor Kellner is just stating an actual fact. You cannot connect with God. God is, transcendent. I don't think you would even deny that. But I think you would say that even though there is, God's transcendence, and we can't, literally, let's call it, connect with God in the way I connect to, another human being, because you can, of
course not,
see him
right.
or touch him and But you're saying that there is such a thing as a mystical experience, however hard it is to define that, but there is a way for man to elevate from within himself and reach a higher consciousness. And
Absolutely.
I actually don't think he would probably argue with that, but yeah, I understand what you're saying.
Absolutely. I put my book out there, and I continue teaching this, and those who join me, for, serious Sephardic Jewish meditation, are beneficiaries of what I believe is a profound Jewish mystical experience, teachings.
So we have about 10, 12 minutes left.
I want 1 minute to call you guys out on something. Tell me when I can do that.
Please go ahead.
Absolutely.
Now?
Yeah.
Now.
Okay, so you guys call your program Judaism Demystified. I believe Judaism is completely mystified.
We
should clarify that demystified actually just means making complex matters simpler. That's really what it means.
Or in reality, really what
it's not that Judaism is you're not trying to demystify Judaism.
No. But I knew when I came up with his name that it would be something that will rattle people a little bit. And
Good.
Because
no, but I think a little bit more to the point is that really it's really Kabbalah that is something that we try to demystify. You understand? So I don't think that Judaism demystified, I don't think that was meant to mean that there is no such thing as mysticism, but rather popular mysticism,
right?
Popular mysticism demystified.
I think
that's
average,
really what it was.
The average Orthodox Jew is not familiar with Maaseh Merkabah. They understand mysticism as Kabbalah.
Yeah.
So
right.
So that actually is a great segue to the next part, the last part, which is about your the thesis in your book about mysticism being vastly different than Kabbalah. So if you can give us, please, a background about that.
Okay. Jewish mysticism has to be solely focused on God. Kabbalah, on the other hand, is focused on the human being, on the person, on the individual, on the experience I had, on how devotional I am, and how do I show my devotion by if kazait of matzah is what the Chachamim ask of me, I'm 10 kazait, you know what I'm saying? Because it means that I'm going to have some impact on God or on the universe, and I'll be able to twist God's arm and, be in his right, be in his good list, his people list. Mm-hmm. And HaRambam is so clear, to the point where he's so brave. He says clearly, if I could pull out my guide, I would read it to you. I've got 10 copies everywhere except on this desk. HaRambam says that you're closest to God through knowledge. And he explicitly says, not through prayers and fasting. Now, he doesn't mean that he's against prayer. Doesn't mean that he's against fasting when it's appropriate. But HaRambam is teaching us that the mystical experience is my movement towards God, not God's movement towards me. And this is where we part ways. Not to mention the carelessness that, beginning with the Zohar and through all the Kabbalistic writers, the carelessness with corporeality and God having emotions and God having mercy or God being angry or God this or God. I've had these conversations with Kabbalists here and in Israel. Oh, of course I don't believe God has a body. So why are you using that language? So there's this carelessness, like it's okay. It does matter. This idea that Chabad loves HaRambam, but they have big problems with HaRambam. Problem number one is HaRambam believed in being educated. And while Chabad, there are many educated Chabad, but in their yeshivot, they don't educate their kids except through the traditional Chabad texts. Problem number two they have is the soul. Chabad, as well as European Jewry, bought into this, and I apologize for saying this, Christian notion that depending on who you are is depending the soul you have. So if you're the monarch, you have a great divine soul. If you're nobility, you have a lower soul. If you're a peasant, you have a lesser soul. And if you're just a slave, you have no soul. And so what does Judaism say? Chabad promotes this notion that the Jewish people have an elevated soul and the Goyim have an animal soul. How could you walk a moral, ethical line by believing that? It just doesn't make sense. In HaRambam's economy of ideas, all human beings are equal, Jewish, non-Jewish, religious, not religious. Your relationship with God it depends on your actions, not on the soul you're created with. And then the last problem Chabad has with real, pure Jewish mysticism is that mitzvot are some sort of reward. You know what I'm saying? It's like some sort of checklist.
Vending machine.
Yeah, exactly. And this idea of the mezuzot or about this or about that, that's just the way they operate. And that's why they stand on street corners and say, you put on tefillin for 30 seconds, you've got a check up in heaven. To me, it's offensive. Honestly, it's offensive to think that way. I'm offended for God. I'm offended for Hashem. That's the real truth. And so this whole movement is out there that calls itself Kabbalistic movement, has nothing to do with rabbinic Judaism. It's so far from the tradition our Chachamim put forth for us, which is recorded in HaRambam's Mishneh Torah and HaRambam's Igrot, HaRambam's Hakdamot, and HaRambam's Moreh HaNevukhim.
I think a lot of the issues you see today is that, even there's also this this difference between, let's say, Chabad or other Hasidic groups that believe in reincarnation, and Rambam is very clear that there's finality after death. And to them, it opens up so many problems just to introduce the idea of reincarnation, especially because it's not rooted in Jewish tradition.
That's a complicated issue, and that it was complicated for HaRambam, and it's complicated for us. I'd rather leave that there. You know what I'm saying? Because we do believe in Tchiyat HaMetim. It's one of HaRambam's 13 principles of faith. But exactly what that means is a different story altogether. What I try to do in my book, and I hope your listeners will, at least take a peek into the book. It's in many libraries already. And if it's not in your local library, ask the library to order it. What I try to address are many of these hot points in the Kabbalistic, popular Kabbalistic literature. What is the soul, neshama and nefesh? What is immortality according to real, according to authentic mystical tradition? What is, this idea, this practice that I call dumia? It's this conscious silence that is required of us. Vaidom Aharon, his children had just died, and instead of screaming and yelling, Vaidom Aharon, it's this conscious silence that preserves his very being, and in Maimonidean thought, it's Lecha Dumia Tehillah. The greatest praise of God is this conscious silence, the ability to just to be inward as opposed to be outward. And here's another difference, Kabbalah is all about outwardness, and Jewish mysticism and Andalusian is about inwardness. So much more to talk about this.
I'm very excited to be. I'm going to start reading it this Shabbat, and I think that this is an extremely important thing. I think that Rambam is usually associated with, like you said, Aristotle, rationalism, and there is some of that for sure. But I think that there's not enough people trying to translate Rambam's mysticism for today's world, so that books like yours start the conversation more on, well, what was the Rambam's understanding of mysticism, meditation, our achieving a higher consciousness. These conversations are not had very much, and so what you did by writing this book and by coming on the pod is extremely important, and we hope to continue that conversation.
And if you could plug your book, where we could find it and where people can reach you.
Thank you. Okay, so people can reach me by just Googling my name, and there's many access points to getting to me, and I'm happy to connect with people. That's just like one of my MOs. I respond to all emails because I love that. I spent a good amount of time doing that. My book, this book of mine, is available on Amazon. It's called The Mysticism of Andalusia, or you just put my name into Amazon and you could get it. I started a blog recently in Stack, what's it called?
Substack.
Substack, right. And just a depository of place where I can put my thoughts, my ideas, some articles. Someone asked me, an email I got recently is, was HaRambam really a mystic? And so I wrote him this long email, and now I put it into my little blog here. It's just available for everybody to look at. Just some thoughts on Pesach that I put out there. It's young, and I'm just gonna try to, just a place where I can dump material. You know what I'm saying? Accessible to whoever's interested. My hope is, with you guys' help and with the help of others like us, the Chabura movement and others like us, really to create a movement that will bring back Judaism to its original glory. To a nation of people that pursue education and chesed and thinking and God. That's really what it's about. And that's really what it's about. And try to really move away from the mythology and thought process. So much. There's just no redeeming quality to them at all. I wish there was. People tell me it makes people religious. That doesn't speak to me. Honestly, that doesn't speak to me. I think people should be religious, but they have to find the right avenue. You don't frighten them to religion, or you don't lie to them into religion. You have to tell them. You have to show them what the beauty of religion is.
Amazing.
Emet.
Really, this was a wonderful talk, and
thank you.
Hope to speak soon, be in touch, and hopefully we'll get to join you for one of your classes or more.
Thank you. That would be fantastic. I'd love your feedback on the book. I know, Ben, you started reading it. Benson, I'd love to get your input.
Well, I'm going to email you.
Please.
We'll discuss some things.
Yeah, and send me your email anyway, so I can put you into my blog email.
Sure.
Wonderful. Gentlemen, thank you. Shabbat shalom. We'll speak to you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.